Hello everyone, welcome to the last day of ESM 2021. My name is Marcus Kalinowski, I'm the program co-chair of ESM 2021 together with Maria Teresa Baldassari. And it's an honor for us at ESM to receive Maria Lomeli and Mark Harman of Facebook UK for their keynote speech on measurement challenges for CyberCyber digital twins, experience from the deployment of Facebook's WW simulation system. Maria Lomeli is currently a software engineer in the London probability team at Facebook, working on the WW CyberCyber digital twin. Previously, she was a senior research scientist at Babylon Health, UK, and a postdoctoral researcher in machine learning at the University of Cambridge. She was awarded a PhD in statistical machine learning from the Gatsby unit, University College of London. Her scientific work combines aspects of software engineering and machine learning at scale, and has been published in the leading venues on both machine learning, such as ICML and NeuroIPS, and on software engineering, such as ICSI. She has given over 30 talks internationally on her scientific work. Mark Harman is a full-time research scientist in the London probability team at Facebook, working on the WW CyberCyber digital twin. Mark is also part-time professor at UCL, and was previously the manager of Facebook's Sapiens team, which grew out of Magic, a startup co-founded by Mark and acquired by Facebook in 2017. The Sapiens tech has been fully deployed as part of Facebook's overall CI system since 2017, and the Facebook Sapiens continues to develop and extend it. Prior to working at Facebook, Mark was head of software engineering at UCL and director of its Crest Center. In his more purely scientific work, Mark co-founded the field Search-Based Software Engineering in 2001, now the subject of active research in over 40 countries worldwide. He received the IEEE Harlan Mills Award and the ACM Outstanding Research Award in 2019 for his work, and was awarded the Fellowship of the Royal Academy of Engineering in 2020. Maria and Mark, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Hi, thanks very much, Marcos. Thanks for that introduction. So we're delighted to be here today, virtually, not in Barry, unfortunately, but we're still very delighted to be here to talk to you today about Facebook's CyberCyber digital twin, which we call DubDub. So DubDub is WW. It's called that because it's a kind of simulation of our whole DubDub platform, the whole World Wide Web platform at Facebook. So I'm going to speak first and then give a little bit of context on what is this cyber digital twin, why it's important for us at Facebook. And I hope I'll also be able to convince you that simulation in general and cyber digital twins in particular are an important challenge for software engineers and something we should perhaps pay a little bit more attention to than we have done hitherto. And I'll hand over to Maria, who's going to deep dive on some more of the technical issues and how these relate to empirical software engineering and measurement. So Maria and I both come from a team based in London, part of the Facebook office in London. I think it's still the second biggest engineering office outside of the US for Facebook. Several thousand engineers work there. And our team, we have 8 engineers, 8 really wonderful engineers, and a manager, Sophia Drossopoulou, who's also a part-time professor at Imperial College, London. We recently had 2 wonderful interns, Ryan and Arthur, who came from Cambridge and Imperial College. And we have 2 other visiting researchers working with us, Steve Omohundro and Simon Lucas. Simon is also a part-time professor at Queen Mary at the moment. Yeah. So that's our team. And the work we're presenting today is the work of the whole team. It's a great privilege to be here to present it. So when we think about a system like Facebook, it's a very, very large system. It's easy to say it's big. So let me give you some numbers to illustrate what we mean by that. This is a visualization, by the way, of the social network. You can essentially, every edge here is a friendship edge and every node is a person. And so you can see the scale in that visual sense. If we turn this into numbers, what it means is that every day, 1.84 billion people use Facebook for social media, for networking, for keeping in touch with the people that matter to them and for communications. So if we think about what that means over the whole suite of apps that are deployed by Facebook, which includes WhatsApp, Instagram, Messenger, how many people use these each month? It's nearly 3 billion people. So it's more than a third of the population of the planet. But as software engineers, what does that mean for us? So what that means in software engineering terms is that we have an enormous repository, over hundreds of millions of lines of code in the back-end system. And this corresponds to over 100,000 commits to that repository every week. So every few minutes, there's a change to the system. And these changes need to be tested and assured. And so one of the challenges here is like, how can we get on top of this complexity? And one way we can do that is to use simulation. So as well as all of the other panoply of technologies that we use in the company, we've got a simulation platform that we call DubDub, and it's a web-enabled simulation. So what that means is it executes on the real platform itself. So when I say to you simulation, as a professor, you might think of maybe a coursework you would have set for your students, something like simulating planetary motion. It's a lovely coursework. It's also a nice student project. You've got all the laws of physics. You see the planets moving around. You can experiment with artificial universes. It's a lot of fun. But that's kind of what we might call traditional simulation. It's not web-enabled. We're not simulating on a real platform. We're making an artificial virtual world that we're simulating. And so when I talk about simulation in the context of modern simulation on web-enabled systems, what we really mean is that although we're simulating the user community that's executing on that platform, we're not simulating the platform itself. And this is what we mean when we talk about a cyber digital twin. So we have some papers about this. I haven't got time to go into all the details here, but I would really encourage you to have a look at some of these, because it is a different kind of simulation to what we're used to perhaps in 10, 15 years ago. So the fact that it's a web-enabled simulation, or WES, does give us very fundamental different properties as software engineers from traditional simulation. In particular, it makes our simulation results more realistic. So this paper describes the idea of web-enabled simulation on a real infrastructure. And this was a keynote paper at last year's GI workshop at ICSI. Another paper I'd love to draw your attention to is a more recent one, which describes how this is a cyber digital twin. So there's a lot of work at the moment on cyber physical digital twins. Essentially, it's when you make a simulation of a real system, but the simulation affects the real system and the real system affects the simulation. So they're much more tightly coupled than traditional simulation, and it's called a cyber physical digital twin. But if you think that the thing you're simulating is also itself a software system, then you get a cyber digital twin. And later on in the talk, I'll come back to this and show you why that is fundamentally different as a software engineer. This paper goes into much more detail about this and sets out our agenda for research open problems in cyber digital twins. We recently had a request for proposals, and we'll be announcing 5 winners from that funding request shortly. So in the talk today, this is a keynote at ESAM, and we also have a keynote paper which Marcos and Filippo and the colleagues were kind enough to allow us to include in your proceedings with this talk. So what we're going to be talking about today, myself and Maria, will actually be covered in more detail in this paper, which specifically focuses on the measurement challenges that come up when you're simulating in the way we are in our cyber digital twin. So let's have a little bit of a look at what this platform looks like at the top level. So if you think about the Facebook infrastructure, it consists largely of 2 fundamental components. There's huge data stores, and they really are tremendously large. And there's tremendous processing elements, essentially a large cloud-based system with an enormous back-end database. So what does it mean to deploy a simulation on top of that infrastructure? Well, we're going to simulate the user behavior. So we need bots. So here are some bots, and those bots perform actions and they make observations. But they make the observations from the real infrastructure and they perform the actions on the real infrastructure. So when one bot sends a message to another bot, it goes through the same back-end stack, that same 100 millions of lines of code in the back-end infrastructure that you would go through when you send a message from one of your friends. So the bots are simulated. They're simulating user behavior, but the behavior of the bots through the system is not simulated. Now, all of these bots can be rewarded for doing things. And one of the things we're going to focus on in this talk is what happens when people misbehave online? How can we try and curtail harmful behavior online and keep people safer? And this is something which is ideally explorable in a simulation setting for obvious reasons. We can't really explore that in production or on real people. We need a simulated environment. It's also important to note that all the interactions between these bots are just between other bots. So although it's on the real infrastructure, it's in a virtualized, safe, walled garden, if you will. We talk about how we do that in detail in the paper, but essentially we're executing on the real infrastructure, but completely isolated from production. So how do we train these bots to simulate real user behavior? Well, we can use a variety of techniques. We do use rule-based behaviors. So for example, we could simulate a depth-first search behavior where a bot starts crawling through the platform, choosing friends according to rules which describe which friend they're going to go to next as they crawl about the platform. And then when no more friends are visible, they might backtrack. It's a very simple rule-based behavior that allows a bot to navigate the graph. But perhaps a little bit more interesting and exciting from a technological point of view, we can use supervised machine learning. So in this case, we'll collect anonymized data. So all users are de-identified in this, and we're only collecting course level statistical properties. From those, we learn generalized patterns at scale of the kind of behaviors that we see online. And then we train the bots to imitate that reality. So essentially, this is an application of imitation learning. So let's look at what that means in terms of behaviors. And we're going to be focusing in this talk on the kinds of harmful behavior that we want to try and simulate so that we can make ways to make it harder for that harmful behavior to take place online. And I'm going to look in particular at bot crawling type behaviors. And these are the kinds of backbone behavior that would support harmful behavior like scamming and spamming. We're going to focus on those in this talk. But what we're talking about with web-enabled simulation can apply to any harmful behavior online, and we can use it to tackle that. So a bot traversal conceptually looks like this. We have a social graph, those nodes there, the white nodes, and we have a bot, the blue node, that's going to do a traversal by looking at the graph and then say it's going to look, okay, what friend? I've only got one friend available here, bot number 2, so I'll go and visit that friend. I record the trajectory as a traversal of the bot. Now I've got 4 friends available, 11, 9, 3, and 10. So actually it chooses to go to 3 next. Now I've only got 1 to go to, so I go to 4, and then so on. You can imagine what we can record now is a bot traversal. And that's how we would have a bot simulate crawling behavior. So an important principle at Facebook and for other companies with online offerings is that detection of harmful behavior is not really as powerful as prevention of harmful behavior. So I want to illustrate this by an analogy with a road situation. Suppose you're driving along the road. It's a lovely, lovely day. It's an autumn day. The trees are all a beautiful different hue. We're in Barry. The sun is still shining. It's a lovely warm day. We're driving along in our camper van to Eastham. Got a van full of researchers, all happy, and then suddenly a Ferrari comes past, way past the speed limit, nearly knocks us off the road. What can we do about that? Well, sadly, as the driver of the camper van or the happy research students in the back, there's not a lot we can do. But as the platform provider, the owner of the road, there's quite a lot we can do. And the things we might do to intervene fall into 2 categories. Let's think about the mechanisms that we can design to prevent this bad behavior. We can use detection technologies. So in the UK, speed cameras are actually painted bright yellow like this. This is what they look like. And we can use prevention technologies. So in the UK, and it's common in other countries, we use speed humps. Now, in the road situation, the speed humps are not that great. Firstly, they don't actually stop people speeding. They make it even more dangerous when they do. And they're not harm-free to people who are not speeding at all. They still damage the suspension of the car. So they're not very popular with motorists. Nevertheless, we still use them because it's the best we've got. Furthermore, the detection technology cameras, not that ideal. The reason they're painted bright yellow like this in the UK is essentially to try and turn a detection technology into a prevention technology. You see the bright yellow camera, you slow down in theory. think about how different it is if we're doing mechanism design in software. On the road, you can only really do so much with tarmac and concrete. So you put these barriers in place, and that will harm normal user behavior, and it won't actually prevent the harmful behavior that you want to prevent. Similarly, with detection technology like cameras, by the time you've detected the bad behavior, it's already too late. But in software, we have this incredible ability to adjust even little small things and make tiny little changes, which when summed up together, can have a profound effect on the way people use our platform. This is much more subtle and nuanced than the way that a road engineer might design a road system. So we call this mechanism design. And in the case of Dub, what that means is that we're rewarding the bots for this crawling behavior, essentially simulating harmful behaviors online. They're performing these actions and observations on the real infrastructure. So everything is actually very realistic. It's not like a simulation in the sense of simulating planetary motion. The bots are really doing the same things that real users do. It's just their behavior is simulated. And then on those actions and observations, we interpose things like rate limits, and we transform the observations they see. So essentially, it might be that one bot can only send so many messages per minute, or can only read so many messages per minute. Or you can imagine a whole panoply. Maybe only a certain number of friends are visible. All these different rate limits are designed to create a space, a search space, if you will, within which we can search for small product changes, which will make it harder for people to achieve those harmful behaviors, but will not impede the ability of normal users to achieve their normal behavior on the platform. And what's different about software, which is why it's so wonderful to be a software engineer compared to any other kind of engineer, is that we have this ability. We have this ability to make nuanced speed hump changes where there's a whole panoply of tiny speed humps, which together can create a kind of net around our software such that harmful behaviors become much, much harder and normal behaviors are not impeded at all. So as you might imagine, we use search-based software engineering as a search approach to try and find changes that will have those properties, and it formulates as a nice multi-objective optimization problem. I'd love to talk more about that, but there isn't time today, but I would refer you to the papers that contain more details. Just before I conclude, I want to come back to the starting point where I started on this idea that what we're talking about here is a cyber digital twin of Facebook. So let's just look a little bit more about what that entails. So the real Facebook platform started in 2004. It's now got, as we say, nearly 3 billion monthly active users. But we could think of it in the lens of recent software engineering research. You could think of it as a cyber physical system. There's the real users who are part of the real world, and they're interacting with this virtual platform. And it's, you could think of it even as a cyber physical twin of real social interactions. That's a bit more of a philosophical point, but let's build on top of that our dub system and see what that means technically. So we have a bunch of bots, and those bots simulate the real users, and that's the only thing that's simulated at this point. We have an online simulation, but it's an online simulation of the user behaviors, not of the platform. So it's online means that when these bots interact, they're actually interacting with the real Facebook platform. Now, the interesting thing is, because it's a cyber digital twin, that means it can have its own cyber digital twin. So on top of the online simulation, we can build a simulation of the simulation. We can make an offline version. We can make synthetic graphs. We can make all sorts of other versions of the Facebook platform, which are themselves simulations of our online simulation. And so we use the online simulation to populate aspects of our offline simulation, for example. And then from those offline simulations, we could even go a step further, and we could use machine learning to emulate learn the behaviors of our bots on the offline simulation of the online simulation, for example, and then we get an emulated version of the offline version of the online version of the real platform. So what we've got here is a hierarchy of cyber digital twins, each of which simulates an aspect of the one below it in the hierarchy. And why do we want a hierarchy? Well, software engineers love the ability to trade precision for speed. It's fundamental to our discipline. And what we do as we go up this hierarchy is we essentially trade precision for speed. The emulator is the fastest by about 5 orders of magnitude, but it's also the least precise and the furthest away from the real infrastructure. And therefore, the fidelity of the simulations may be somewhat impaired by comparison with the simulations we get from the online version. So the bots can interact with these cyber simulations of the Facebook platform, and they can interact at each of these levels of trade-off between precision and speed. So I hope that's given you an overview of our DubDub system and why web-enabled simulation is different from traditional simulation, why being software engineers is so much more exciting and has so many more possibilities. And now I want to hand over to my colleague, Maria Lomeli, who's going to deep dive further into the technical issues that come up when you do this kind of work. Thanks very much. Over to you, Maria. I think you're muted, Maria.
Thank you so much, Mark. Yeah, so I'm going to be continuing on what a simulation consists on and what sort of measurement challenges we have, as Mark described. So first, I'm just going to tell you what a DubDub simulation consists on. And because, as Mark was saying, usually when people hear the word simulation, they actually think about simulations of physical systems that are fully deterministic in nature. For example, I can use an ordinary differential equation to describe the laws of a system, and like the planetary motions example that Mark gave us. But in contrast, our DubDub simulations are stochastic because they have different sources of stochasticity, such as one is that we are simulating the user's behaviors. And then the other one is that because the simulations run on the real Facebook infrastructure, we are subject to infrastructural changes. And then one of our goals for building this platform, the DubDub platform, is to perform simulation-based testing, which means that we want to benefit from community behaviors, and we want to use these social interactions to figure out things that go wrong in the system. So in order to do this, your first question will be, how can you connect bots so they are able to interact in such a system? And so for connecting the bots, what we use is we generate first a synthetic graph to encode the friendship relationships between the bots. And we also generate some synthetic features for each bot. So in the picture in the slide, you can see that the first ingredient we need is the synthetic graph. And the reason why we use this is for privacy reasons. So as you know, Facebook contains user-sensitive data and attributes, so we don't really want to just take the real Facebook friendship graph for the bots. So we want to have our own, as well as the features. We don't want to use any potentially sensitive information. So that's how we start now. So we can start our DubDub simulation with this skeleton graph. And then what we do is we put bots in each of the nodes of the graph, and each bot opens their Facebook accounts in order to be able to run on the real platform. And this is one thing that Mark already noted, is that this is fully isolated from production. In other words, our bots cannot interact or see what real Facebook users are doing. But they can happily interact with all the Facebook services. So for example, one of our bots can go and create the group called How to Relax, and then successively some other bots will be joining that group. And then another thing that a bot can do is they can create a Facebook page, for example, the page Coffee Lovers, and then some other bots from the community can go and become fans and follow that page as you would in Facebook, in the real Facebook. Then one bot can, as Mark said, like one bot can message the other bot, and then the other bot will reply to this message, and so on and so forth. So in the end of a DApp simulation, we end up with this population of bots that have performed different actions. And it's not clear, to me at least at the beginning, it wasn't clear at all. How can we know that the simulation has a desired behavior? Because we don't know a priori what is the desired behavior. It could be a lot of things. So for example, we can focus on how the bots were, the order in which the bots were performing the actions. We can also focus on what are the friendship relationships. And also we can, for example, do this, proceed in the following way. So we can run one version of the simulation and then run another and then compare them in some way. So this is the reason why, in general, measuring DApp simulations is hard, because essentially the output is very complex. So you could have like non-Euclidean data, such as the graph, and multi-dimensional data, such as the feature vectors of the users. And moreover, the output can be also, the output also consists on the content that each bot puts out there. So for example, when the bot messages the other bot, there is the text in the message. So then now we can summarize essentially what the output consists on. So one is the actions performed by all bots. The other one is the friendships and interaction graphs, because it's not only that the bot is interacting with the other bots, but they are also interacting with groups and pages, for example. And the third thing is, as I was saying, the content of posts, messages, videos, etc. So this problem is not something that is specific to DApp simulations. The problem of not being able to determine whether the simulation has a desired behavior is called, in software engineering, is called the Oracle problem. So as you all know, like the Oracle assumption is that we are able to routinely determine whether the test output is correct. But in simulations, we cannot do that, essentially because one, there's so much output that it might be impractical to verify all of it. And also two is because of the randomization part. So in other words, if we run the simulation twice, we might get different output. And specifically, since we are modeling the bots' behaviors, we can also compute the action distribution of the bots, but these can be different due to like other things beyond our control, for example, distributional shifts and infrastructural changes. But this is a very big problem that has been discussed in like throughout software engineering, the software engineering literature, and you can see these two papers for more details. So right now you can say, oh, now we can see that there's a problem here, there's no Oracle, so now we might as well go home. But the good news is that even though we are not able to determine a full, complete Oracle, we can nevertheless have some partial oracles, or we can nevertheless measure some attributes of the simulation. So in other words, some examples of some things that we can measure. We can first, for example, encode the structural properties using some graph generation algorithms. I'm going to go into more details of this part later. We can also select some relationships to test using metamorphic testing. And as Mark was saying, we can assert if a piece of content is taken down. We can assert whether there are some harmful behaviors going on and decide and verify whether these are controlled or not. So I'm going to be giving an example of these three statements in the following slides. So the first thing I want to discuss is the graph generation algorithms. So if you see this slide, here I'm just showing you a synthetic graph that is only 1,000 nodes in it. There's only 1,000 nodes in it, and it already looks quite complex. So you can imagine that the real Facebook graph is orders of magnitude larger than this, but it also shares some of the structural properties that that this graph has. For example, it is globally sparse, but it also has like these hubs, highly connected clusters. So this is kind of an example of a real life graph that has this desired structure. And essentially, there's a bunch of graph generation algorithms that you can use to encode the clustering structure and the kind of global sparsity. And as I already told you, that the idea of using the synthetic graph for the friendship graph is because of we want to be privacy safe. But at the same time, we care about measuring, or we care about reflecting these real world properties of the friendship graph. Okay, so before I move to my next slide, this was generated using a Python library called NetworkX, and I also use this layout optimization algorithm called SFTP, and essentially this makes it easier to look at the graph. So you can already see the problem that you are starting to bump into when you are like generating graphs at such a scale. It gets very tricky to display them in a meaningful way. But more details about all these interesting graph generation algorithms, you can see them in our paper in the RACE conference this year. And in particular, this is relevant for simulations because we can also vary the structural properties of the start of friendship graph and then see how that affects the behavior of the bots, and we can then optimize accordingly. But I'm not going to go into more details about graph generation, but please, if you have any questions, we can discuss it later at the Q&A. So as I was saying, the next thing we can do is something really easy. We can just do some assertions. And the motivating example is, imagine that you are the owner of the social media and you want to give some guarantees about deletion of offensive content. So we can just quickly check whether, given a bot that posted some offensive content, whether it's taken down at the end. So that is a very simple example of a property test that we can conduct. But then if you think about it, some of the content out there is kind of borderline offensive. It's not black and white whether it will be taken down or not. And it also depends on the classifier's precision and accuracy. So we can also do this property testing, but we can relax the check by, rather than asserting whether it is taken down in all the versions of the code, we can assert whether it's typically fulfilled in most versions of the code. So this is when we get into the stochastic nature of simulations. And another example of this is a metamorphic test where we are crawling the social graph as Mark's example. And you can imagine that when we're crawling this graph, we can focus on given attributes of the bots. And then in this specific case, if we start with a synthetic graph where the proportion of people in their 20s is higher than the proportion of people in their 50s, we can expect that on average, the ages of the visited profiles in the first simulation is less than or equal to the average age in the second simulation. And then, as I was telling you, and I'm just highlighting that the idea of this randomization is the thing that causes the simulation runs to have different output, to produce different output. And sometimes it's not enough to check for averages. And so essentially, the main goal, the main focus of whenever you have a stochastic component should be to have like a decision rule that really tells you whether you can assess some sort of property, for example, the age, or for example, you can also check for the frequency of the action distribution of the bots. And then this is required, so you can use a hypothesis test as this decision rule. But then comes the question, which hypothesis test should I use? So we know that there exists so many hypothesis tests out there. So as you can see in this picture, there's like really a zoo of hypothesis tests. So it's not straightforward to pick which one is good, and it's not something that you can immediately use out of the box, or maybe you can run multiple of them, but it's not really clear which one you should pick. Which leads me to the next slide, which is, as you can see, like, this is a challenge in itself. Just, literally come up with a very tailored approach for measuring your simulations. So because we have like a large variety of statistical tests, the number of choices faced by the user is very large. But so a nice thing to have would be like, how can we guide this decision making? It would be a good thing to have like a guiding light. But then the good news is that I've already shown you that simulation-based testing can be used to test more than what a typical end-to-end testing system would test, because you can capture these community effects. And for the first point, I just wanted to mention that what we would like to have in the future, it's like an automated tester called PAT. And this is like analogous to other efforts out there. So for example, we have the automatic statistician in statistics and machine learning, and we also have the robot scientist that did some falsification approaches for genomics. So our approach would be to have like the practical automated tester PAT, and you can also see our paper for more details about this. But right now, this is most of the material I wanted to present, and I just want to leave this open for questions about everything, and would really like to know what people are thinking out there. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. I think you're muted, Marcus.
Okay, so now we're going to the question answers. I'm going to start making a first question. First of all, congratulations on the speech for both of you. We have a digital twin project ourselves at Korea also, but a much simpler one, simulating the behavior of oil refineries. And we already face several measurement challenges in this context. So the experience you just reported, they are really impressive. What I would like to make as a first question, as part of, as you also included in the paper, is what are the perspectives on software testing, the implications on software testing based on your experiences, the main implications that you see for the area of software testing?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So one thing that we learned is that, as I mentioned at the end, that it's not enough to have like an end-to-end test, because sometimes you have this community effect that, like, your system can potentially have a problem once you reach a certain number of users. So that's what we found, that this is useful for testing that situation when you have all your users and they are suddenly, like, the system suddenly crashes or these sort of issues happen. So that's really cool. Maybe, I think, Mark, maybe you have something that, if you want to add something.
Thanks, Maria. Yes, I think the interesting thing about being in the simulation space, whether it's cyber digital twins like us or cyber physical like you, is that you are actually at the sharp end of the two of the most pernicious problems in testing. One is flakiness, because the underlying systems are inherently stochastic and unpredictable and non-deterministic. And the other is the oracle problem, as Maria mentioned in the talk, because if we're simulating human behavior, so it's not only unknown what the oracle is, it's inherently unknowable. And as Maria said, we found that metamorphic testing is very valuable here. We're actually the first team, I think, in the world to deploy metamorphic testing into continuous integration. We're not the first in the world. Actually, concurrent with that, Google also used metamorphic testing, but not in continuous integration, but to look at third-party graphics software. So after 22 years, metamorphic testing is now actually finding its way into industrial practice. And we have an ICSI paper last year on this, on how we use metamorphic testing. And I think that's a very promising avenue for testing research. And the other thing I wanted to mention is, as Maria said, we have this idea in the ESAM keynote paper that accompanies this talk about PAT, the practical automated tester. And the kind of take-home message there is that what if you could make the automated test tool become part of your team? Just like any other member of the team, this person has special attributes. It's actually an automated system, but it can interact, so that instead of testing just being a kind of binary gatekeeper before you deploy, it's actually an interactive, investigative member of the team who can interact with the others. I think this is in line with a lot of the ideas about bots in software engineering, which is another interesting and important research topic. So with that, I want to I talk too much, so I want to hand back. But I think the answer to your question is there's just so many possibilities for testing here, and for some of the ideas that have been around in testing to get new life, like metamorphic testing, and for the agenda to drive forward the testing research agenda more generally.
Okay, so I'm looking for more questions from the audience. In the meanwhile, I'm going to pose another one, also on a topic that you mentioned in the paper on the challenges for the scientific community. You already talked about the implications of software testing. What would be the main challenges for the scientific community? What should be focused on? You mentioned metamorphic testing and in the continuous integration context. Can you elaborate a bit on that, on the challenges for the scientific community that you see as the main ones to be addressed in this context of cyber physical system, simulation systems?
And thanks, Mark. So I think one of the challenges as well is to, even like when you have this stochasticity in your system, how can you generalize your testing to capture it? Because, so I was mentioning that, for example, the actions, the bots that perform actions, the actions are stochastic in nature. So you end up having like an action distribution. So even though that these might not be stable and might change, you can still make some meaningful tests based on this. So for example, we have a section in the paper where we use the Jensen-Shannon distance to assess whether the action distribution is typical or not. So more work around this area, it's very interesting. To include it in testing, because obviously there's like a lot of statistical literature focusing on how do you compare to probability distributions, but it would be nice if we can incorporate that in our software engineering practice.
So just would this also imply in maybe using Bayesian analysis or this kind of probability distribution analysis over time of the behavior to estimate probabilities based on Bayesian analysis? Have you considered that already also, or?
Yeah, that's a great point. So essentially in our test, we are not being Bayesian, so we are just using a very simple frequentist approach to assess similarity of distributions. But as you say, like maybe you have some a priori knowledge about the action distribution that you can encode in using a priori distributions in general and being fully Bayesian for this. So I think that's also a very nice alternative. And there are many, like for example, you can conduct the Bayesian analog of a hypothesis test, and there's like a lot of research already in the statistics literature where you can be Bayesian but also have some sort of decision rule that you can use for your tests. So it would be very interesting to use in this context.
Okay, any other questions from the audience?
While we're waiting for questions, I just wanted to follow up on your last question, Marcos, a little bit more. You asked about challenges for the scientific community, and I just wanted to mention that we did have a request for proposals this year, and we identified 3 challenges for that one. And then the previous year, we also had a request for proposals. The previous year, it was up to 50K cash gift, unconstrained gift. This year, it was 100K cash gift. You can see a pattern emerging here. We hope to have another similar call next year. And the 3 challenges we identified for this call this year, this call has now closed, but just to illustrate that we do actually provide funding to the scientific community to address these, were testing, the one that we've talked about already, the scalability of the simulation. So this thing of like, how do we trade precision and precision or fidelity of the simulation, how realistic it is with the speed at which you can get the results. And the third one was essentially, how do you imitate user behavior in a way that is privacy safe and is also, faithful to all the complicated and different ways in which humans can behave, which you could think of as either an imitation learning problem or a reinforcement learning problem. Many people in the software engineering community are now getting very excited and interested in machine learning, and there's lots of opportunities there. So those are the three big challenges we identified this year. But in the papers, we always try to include some sense of open challenges, and they're all very interesting to us. So if you read any of these papers and you see a challenge that you think is your research is relevant to, please do reach out to us and get in touch, because we are looking to work with the scientific community. And although we're a big company with a lot of resources, we simply can't tackle all of these scientific challenges ourselves. We need to work in partnership with the scientific community, and we want to do that.
So that sounds like a great opportunity for the scientific community to interact with you. We have a question from Filippo Lanubili. Thanks, Maria and Mark, for the great talk. Does it make sense to test such a giant system based on graph-related invariants? Not sure who wants to start. Maria, maybe?
Thank you, Filippo. That's a great question. And I agree that it would make sense to use this invariant, to use some sort of similarity metric between graphs to see whether the output graph has the desired properties or of like what we expect. Like, for example, I think that right now we focus on simpler statistics, and I'm not very familiar with invariants for graphs, but I'm familiar with, for example, you can summarize a graph with respect to the degree distribution of the graph or the clustering coefficient. So right now what we do is we focus on encoding the real graph's clustering coefficient, the real graph's degree distribution, and the assortativity one. And that's how we, let's say by construction, make sure that the graph has these structural properties. But as you say, so one thing that you could already notice in the example that I gave, in the illustration I gave of the simulation, is that the graph mutates as we go through the simulations. So it would be also interesting to test at the end whether these properties are respected or whether they change. And yeah, I think this is great. So I think this is another useful challenge. Like, what do you do when your data is non-Euclidean? It's like discrete, like a graph. Definitely, there are many open questions.
Okay, Mark, do you want to add anything on this particular question? I'm going to the next question then.
I think Maria covered it. Thanks.
Okay. Next question by Guilherme Travassos. Thanks for the speech. How to deal with the variation of context when executing the testing? I mean, to test takes some time. Simulation does not stop, and context can vary. Who wants to start?
Thanks, Guilherme. I'll go first with that, and then Maria can follow up. So great to have your question again, Guilherme, and nice to see you virtually again, if not in the flesh. So one thing I want to clarify is that we're not really running one simulation in parallel with Facebook running. What we have is a platform that allows us to run multiple simulations. So some of them might be for a few minutes, and others might be for hours or even days. And then there can be multiple simulations running in parallel with different kinds of persona. For example, Maria was talking about the personas. So the different use cases of simulation will have different personas running. So it's true that simulation doesn't stop, but it does stop and start. I mean, like you run a simulation for a period, you collect the results from it, and then you analyze those, and then that's what your tests and what your analysis is based on. But as Maria said, underneath all of that, the global social graph is changing all of the time, and so that is an interesting challenge. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question. I'll hand to Maria and then maybe come back if you have a follow-up.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I completely agree with Mark that essentially maybe we made it sound like it was one big simulation that was running all the time, but I mean we could have that, but in practice what we do is we depending on the use case, we use different lengths. So for example, if you want to, you can think about how the infrastructure changed from one day to the other. So you can think of running the simulation today and running it tomorrow, and then assessing the differences between both cases. Or if you are working, I'm working on my piece of code and then I push it, I can also do this, test the different versions of the code by running a simulation on like the code before my change and the code after my change.
Okay, great, thank you. We have another question from Susanna Brown. Thanks for the great talk. How do you ensure technically that the bots of your simulation are isolated from the real users? Do the bots just act as a second deployment of the Facebook platform? Just to explain how the CyberCyber digital twin works.
Yes, thanks, Suzanne. That's a very interesting and important question that goes to the heart of what we're doing. Most of the challenge here is engineering, not scientific, I have to say. So there are a whole range of technologies that we use to ensure not only that the bots are isolated, but that, like we have, it's important that they remain isolated, obviously. So we have multiple locks, it's kind of belt and braces approach. Essentially, there's a tension here because you do want to have realistic tests. So you want the bots on the real platform, but obviously they have to be isolated. Fortunately, we have whole separate tiers and shards that gives us one level of isolation. We also have privacy rules that we encase the bots in to make them invisible. And we have a number of other techniques which are described in our papers that essentially ensure that the bots stay in a walled garden where they can only communicate with each other. Most of the detail, as I say, of how we achieve that is an engineering challenge. It's not really a research topic per se, I think. So perhaps not of such interest from a scientific perspective, but it is nonetheless an important issue and one that we've paid a lot of attention to.
Okay. We have another question from None New. When does WES testing stop and intervention feature gets deployed?
So yeah, I think this is what we were saying, that essentially if you want to test a feature, you can run your simulation before the feature is deployed and after, and then see whether your feature is breaking anything. So in other words, you have control. That's like a user parameter. We can also run it for longer if your use case needs it, but maybe, like, I just want to emphasize that this is like something that you can select. So it can vary, the length of the simulation can vary depending on what you have in mind.
Yeah, I think go on, Maria.
Yes, no, Mark, go on.
No, it's a great question. I think it's important to understand that there isn't really just like simulation is one answer to one problem. Simulation has slightly different characters for each of our different use cases. So for example, I was talking about mechanism design, where you're essentially doing hundreds of thousands of different counterfactual versions of your platform and assessing how those work. And it might be purely exploratory. You might not deploy anything. You might decide, well, actually, this feature, we won't deploy it after all. On the other hand, moving to the other end of the spectrum, every time someone puts up a change to the software system, we can potentially run a simulation on that change to check if it breaks any of those metamorphic relations that are of importance. We were presenting, our colleagues Ina Dvortsova and Natalija Gucevska were presenting keynotes at industry conferences the last couple of weeks. And the big thing there is this whole idea of shift left, essentially shift your testing leftwards in your development life cycle so that you can move from detecting bugs to preventing them even getting deployed. And we're very much bought into that methodology at Facebook. So we like that every time someone puts up a diff, which is our version of a pull request. So every time someone essentially publishes a change to the software, we want to run a whole load of tests on them. Now, at the moment, it's too expensive to run simulation on every single change, but we do already run simulation on some sets of changes that affect pieces of the infrastructure that, for example, affect the simulation system itself. And we do hope to extend that. So essentially, the answer to your question could be like every time someone runs a change, we run a small simulation on it to essentially check whether it's broken any of these big community level properties. And in this way, we shift our whole testing effort left and we prevent those kind of bugs getting into deployment.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think we reached the end of our keynote talk. So I invite everyone to read the paper, which is included in the ACM Digital Libraries proceeding. So there's a 10-page paper by Mark and Maria and the team explaining the CyberCyber digital twin a bit better, and all the simulation of the dub system and at Facebook. So feel free to take a look at the paper. Thank you very much, Mark and Maria, for the marvelous keynote, and thanks to all the audience. I would like to remind you all that we have a next session at ASM starting at 2:20, which is on mining software repositories. So I hope to see you all there. Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you, Maria. It was a pleasure to have you here at ASM. Thank you. Bye-bye. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.